Wedding planners, what's your worst Bridezilla story? I worked at a wedding where the bride and groom were hippie potheads, and the groom's father was the chief of the local police. They were all from the same little town. One side of the room was a sea of cops. The other was dreadlocked, patchouli-wearing, barefooted hippies. After dinner was over, the entire hippie crowd went outside and stood in a huge circle and smoked massive amounts of weed while the cops looked on with utter disgust on their faces. It was epic. The bride was also high on pills and came to when she caught wind that someone was planning an after-party without her approval, and she didn't like that one bit. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, "Where is she?" over and over again while she stormed around in search of her victim. When she found the girl, who was a bridesmaid, she proceeded to freak the out on her in the middle of the dance floor, in front of 300 people. The bridesmaid started to cry and the bride completely lost her mind. All anyone could do was stare with our mouths hung wide open in disbelief. The words that came out of that bride were some of the absolute worst known to mankind. Several people tried to step in, but the bride lashed out at everyone. It was the single most disgusting thing I've ever seen. The girl ran off and the bride proceeded to pass out on a couch in the bathroom. When it's your big day, for the love of God, please don't take pills. I work at a wedding bakery, and part of my job is to help pair couples with the correct designer for their cake. One bride wanted a cake large enough to feed 500 people, and she wanted it to float. This multi-tiered cake was going to be filled with fresh berries and custard, covered with buttercream and fondant, and decorated with edible flowers and more fresh fruit. And she wanted us to somehow defy the laws of physics and make it float. Apparently, she had seen a floating cake in an anime and decided nothing else was acceptable. When I told her we can't make floating cakes, she threw her coffee on the floor and cried that we were ruining her wedding. Her fiancé ushered her out the door, and I never saw either of them again. Another flat out refused to make any decisions because her mom gave her $10,000 for the cake, so she whined that she may as well just buy a cheap Duncan Hines one. This sticks out to me because 10 grand is more than the total budget for a lot of weddings, and this chick whined because it was her cake budget. One bride threatened to leave her fiancé before they were even married because he didn't want a chocolate cake. He told her his kids were allergic and walked out on the appointment. She was absolutely shocked. Another brought her ex to the appointment instead of her fiancé. She introduced him as such, which is how I know he wasn't the groom. They were blatantly flirty, and the bride joked that they would be getting married if he made more money and could treat her like a princess. It was an outside ceremony at a golf course, with an inside reception. About an hour before the ceremony, the skies went dark and storm clouds began rolling in. I tell my outdoor bride that we need to call the wedding no later than 30 minutes in advance, so we have time to move guests indoors, as well as any other items. In this case, the bride had a beautiful indoor location that was easily used for both ceremony and reception. I suggest to the bride that she move her ceremony inside. She says no, she wants it outside. I show her the clouds. "It's Seattle," she says. "There are always clouds." Well, yeah, but these are storm clouds, and you have 200 people sitting outside on a golf course. She still won't budge. No amount of reasoning is helping. 20 minutes before the ceremony, and it starts to get windy. Nothing big yet, but this is just another sign that wet weather is upon us. She still won't reconsider. Several guests are seated outside. Many hover inside the reception area because it's cold out now. I tell her it's the last call and warn her what happens if it rains during the ceremony. She still wants it outside. The ceremony begins. It starts to sprinkle. Bridesmaids are getting wet as they walk down the aisle. Shoes are sinking into the grass. Guests are looking worried. The bride walks down the aisle just as big wind gusts begin. Rain starts to fall in earnest. Guests try to use umbrellas, but it's just too gusty. We aren't even 5 minutes into the ceremony when the heavens suddenly open and it pours. Guests start screeching and start moving inside. The ceremony is still happening for the bride, but guests are bailing. Musicians grab their instruments and head inside. The bridal party continue to stand there like nothing is happening, much like the band on the Titanic. There are maybe 20 guests left. Everyone else has bailed. It is an open downpour. Anyone left is just soaked. The officiant is rushing now, though there isn't really anyone left to witness vows. Before they got to the kiss, lightning began. At that point, they finally bailed. The bride and bridal party spent the reception looking like drowned rats. The bride was just ruined, runny makeup, hair smooshed. She had rashes on her skin from being wet all night. Wet lace and heavy ball gowns are not easily worn wet. All the decor that was meant to move inside following the ceremony was ruined. Thousands of dollars on flowers and centerpieces down the drain, literally. And in the end, hardly anyone witnessed the ceremony at all, and they didn't even get to finish. Bad bride. Please like and subscribe for more videos like this. Thank you. I work as a hotel manager, and we see bridezillas all the time. The worst was when a bride was so upset that she couldn't fit all of her bridesmaids on one shuttle back from the reception that she tried to physically assault the driver. He left her on the side of the road when she tried to bite him. The kicker? When the groom found out and came to get her, she was acting so crazy that he went to pick her up with her parents, and when they found her trudging back down the highway and heard about her shitty attitude, they left her there too. I worked for a few years as a wedding singer. The worst wedding disaster I've seen was directly caused by a bridezilla. If you've ever been to a wedding, you know that weddings run behind schedule. This bride was adamant that everything should be on time. Of course, it being a wedding, everything was running behind for about 30 minutes. At 7:55, she could no longer handle that the wedding was running late and decided to skip ahead to the hora, the traditional Jewish wedding dance. The hora was scheduled for 8 p.m. We, the band and the wedding planner, suggested that we should not skip ahead, but she was having none of it. With her face red with effort, she screamed at us that Hava Nagila would start at 8 p.m. and not a minute later. Well, she was paying us, so we did what we were told. We started Hava Nagila at precisely 8 p.m. The guests rose and began to form a circle, as they have done countless times before. But something was amiss. The groom was nowhere to be found. The bride was alone in the center of the circle. As if on autopilot, the guests danced and sang while the bride's expression changed from confused to horrified to hysterical. It was a train wreck. They finished the dance without the groom ever arriving. The bride was sobbing uncontrollably. The groom was outside having a cigarette because the wedding was running 30 minutes late. He knew the schedule and thought he had time for the cigarette. In the end, it was the bride's own stubborn insistence that led to the tragic ending. She was the captain of her own Titanic, and we were the band playing as it sank. I sometimes wonder how that marriage worked out. My number one advice to people getting married is to enjoy their wedding day. Instead of trying to control and manage everything, spend your wedding day celebrating with your guests. No wedding ever goes perfectly. Considering you ideally only do it once, do your best to enjoy the ride. I briefly worked in event production management. I had the pleasure of being at this event working a photo booth at a beautiful church. It's a simple gig. The weather was gorgeous, the view was gorgeous, everything was great. The second I got there, one of our photographers comes up to me with a glass of champagne, chugs it, and says, "I've been here since noon." It was 8 p.m. In the distance, the bride was screaming and cussing up a storm. I talked to the photographer a bit longer and found out that the bride punched her mother in the face during photos. The bride kicked out the groom's best man and she cussed out our videographer. This woman was going mad. Everything was cussing, screaming, yelling, scolding. To put it in perspective, halfway through the reception, the bride shouted for her pussy bitch husband to get our money's worth at the photo booth. Later that night, I watched her shove a groomsman to the ground when he asked her to calm down. She eventually broke into tears randomly at some point. Wedding DJ here, and it wasn't the bride, it was a groomzilla. For some reason, the newlyweds decided to invite the bride's son's father. The dance floor cleared early and everyone was in the photo booth or outside smoking and drinking, except the baby daddy and the groom. They're sitting at a table alone and appear to be having a raucous, laughing conversation. A short while later, their faces are getting angry looking. The groom now has his finger on the baby daddy's chest and shouts, "He calls me dad now! I'm his father!" The groomsmen come running in to hold them both back. The groom flips the table over. The bride is now in tears. It was magical. I used to shoot wedding videos. I was assigned this wedding and no one told me anything was special about it. I show up and it was an Indian wedding. The bride and groom had already eloped months earlier, and this was all for show. So what did the bride and groom do? Sat there and talked about all their guests. I had way too much audio about how the bride's mother's cousin was a drunk and a slut. Then we go to the reception. The reception lasted 8 hours. I brought enough batteries and tapes, but Jesus, that was a long time. I set a camera up at one end of the hall for a long shot, then a slightly closer shot from over the DJ booth, and I was doing handheld camera work. Every few songs, I'd move my long shot cam to get a different angle. Now we go into the edit phase. This is really the first time I ever interacted with the couple. I got shots while they were getting ready, but we didn't really talk that much. So I'm editing, and we have a standard format we follow. A montage in the beginning, ceremony footage, first dance, father-daughter dance, mom-son dance, cake cutting, random footage of people dancing, basic stuff. It ends up being about 2 to 4 hours once everything is done. Theirs was 5 hours long. We gave them a copy, and the next day the bride stormed in, demanding the rest of her wedding. I have no idea what she's talking about, and I don't get paid for any re-editing work. We gave her an hour longer than any video I'd ever done, but that wasn't enough. She wanted all 8 hours of the reception. I loaded all my shots up and did huge cuts where I'd stay on a shot until it sucked, then I'd change it. Some shots wouldn't move for 3 songs. There was no way I was spending a lot of time on this. We finally finished and exported the video to DVD. We called her in and she wanted to watch it in the store, and she brought a notepad. As she's watching, she's making an edit list of things she wants me to change. That list ended up being 3 pages. I stood up, looked her in the face, and said, "This job isn't worth it. I quit." That was the last wedding video I ever edited. We've had quite a few Bridezillas and mother-in-law Zillas over the years. During the first dance between the bride and groom, the mother-in-law began crying and cut between the two of them, danced with her son for a moment, and then sank down to her knees. She gradually kept moving down until her face was on the floor. When her husband and the bride's father went over to get her up, she was a blubbering mess. Mascara like wild tree roots across her cheeks, snotty nose, red eyes, quivering double chin, the works. It was painful to watch. Another bride wasn't happy with her husband-to-be's vows, so she requested a time out for him to go to the back room and come up with better ones. When the guy marrying them politely explained that he was on a very tight schedule, she called him a lying bastard and huffed back up the aisle into the room. We kept everyone else seated, and she appeared a few minutes later with freshly written vows for her future husband. He read them, and the wedding continued as planned. Again, uncomfortable. We rarely get a groomzilla, but one in particular stands out. The groom wasn't happy with anything. The bride had her heart set on white roses, but he said he didn't like roses, so he requested sunflowers and white chrysanthemums. When we presented him with an example display of sunflowers and chrysanthemums, he said he didn't like that either and requested another 2 or 3 separate types before finally settling on a bunch of plain peonies. He did the same sort of thing with the food, music, and entertainment, ignoring the fact that we have deadlines to meet. The bride had 0 say and didn't try to fight him on it. At another wedding, some little kid rubbed his finger along the cake icing, leaving an unattractive mark on it. Understandably, the bride was pissed, but she lost her with the groom as the kid was on his side of the family. This caused a rift between the two families. Whether or not they patched things up, I have no idea. Another bride went into full-on tantrum mode when a few things didn't quite go to plan. Rain, wind, a couple of late guests, and 2 hungover bridesmaids. She literally threw her hands in the air and said, "Well, we might as well cancel the whole f***ing thing then." The wedding did not continue. For all the shitty ones, though, there have been some absolutely wonderful ones. I've worked as a waiter at one of the more fancy wedding reception venues in my city, and we get a lot of old Italian, Greek, and generally European family weddings. I have 2 that stand out. The groom got mega-plastered and smashed a bottle of cognac on the dance floor and literally tried to set it on fire. The function supervisor tried to tell him very politely that he couldn't, and he got upset about that and started screaming, "This is my wedding, and if I want to burn this place down, I will." Cops were called. At another wedding, it was speech time, and the bride gets up to say a few things about how her deceased mother was an inspiration to her, etc. General heartfelt wedding stuff. Her father stands up after and had a few words to say. "You ungrateful little You're the spitting image of your dead mother. I paid $40,000 for this, and I don't even get a mention? You and your dirt husband." Security stepped in at this point and tried to calm him down, so he takes a swing at security and gets kicked out. Cops were also called. I'm not a wedding planner, but I work closely with brides and grooms. I work in the vintage diamond ring business. I'll never forget working with one amazing groom. He spent a small fortune on a gorgeous Victorian engagement ring. It was one of the most beautiful rings I had ever seen. Imagine my shock when I received a call from the groom the next day. She apparently hated the ring and threw a fit because, her words, he bought her a used ring from a garage sale. The ring was from one of the best vintage jewelry stores in the United States and cost $94,000. My friend is a wedding photographer. One time he got punched in the face by the groom because the groom decided that the photographer was taking too many photos of the bride. Weddings seem to bring out the worst in humanity. I was booking a wedding at my store. A young couple comes in and is picking stuff out. As usual, the guy has an I don't care attitude about wedding things. Brides are never happy about this. We go through their options for a bit, but when it comes to picking vest styles, they get into a huge argument right in front of me and my colleague. Eventually, the groom throws up his hands and says, "If we can't decide about colors, then we shouldn't get married." He walks out the door and leaves in his car. The bride starts crying in our store while we are just bewildered. My colleague asked if she was okay. She said she was having someone come pick her up and walked out the door crying. Never saw them again. It's a famous story in our store. I was hired to assist a wedding planner. I had to tie the mother of the bride's sari. While I'm tying it, she tells me I am doing it wrong and wants me to do it her way. I told her that she won't be able to walk if I tied it like she requested. She starts to get frustrated, so I tie her sari in the way she wants. This woman doesn't know how to tie a sari. She apparently doesn't wear them. She comes out and starts screaming and yelling at the wedding planner that I don't know how to tie a sari and now she can't walk. She is in tears. So the planner takes her away, calms her down, and corrects her sari. This leaves me in the prep room with the other girls and the bride. The bride turns to me and starts saying, "How dare you make my mother cry on this day? You are a horrible person, and you are ruining the most important day of my life." I couldn't help it, but I started to laugh and couldn't stop. It was so dramatic. Nothing was ruined. It took 10 minutes to fix, and the mother wouldn't listen to me about how to put one on in the first place. The bride started screaming at me, get out, I don't want to see your face, you ruined everything," and started to cry. I laughed even harder and said, "You are in for a surprise if you think a poorly tied sari is the worst thing in the world." I turned to the wedding planner and told her to pay me so I could go home. The wedding planner called me the next week to help with another wedding. I said no. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to my channel for more Reddit stories. See you in the next video.